this is Kim from Emerging Creatively Tutorials. This is a Tuesday tip for jewelry making. So, one question I get asked often is about wire and what wire to use for certain projects. Now, if you're doing one of my tutorials that you have found on my blog, or if you have purchased one for me, or in any of my e-courses or something like that, I will specifically tell you what kind of wire to use. And actually, what I usually say is this. You should use whatever the gauge is, whatever the hardness is, whatever the shape is. So for example, you should use 20 gauge, half hard, round wire. And typically I'll say you can use any metal you want, because usually if you're just starting, you're not going to want to use sterling silver wire because it's expensive and you are sure to make a mistake, and that can be really disappointing. So as far as what kind of wire to use, what metal, that sort of thing, you can try copper or brass. You can find both of those even in hardware stores. You can also find those in craft stores, and it's much less expensive than sterling silver. You could also use plated copper wire that is made to look, it can be either silver plated or they have lots of colors. So here's an example. You can find it at most craft stores that sell jewelry supplies too. So like for example, I know that Michaels and AC Moore sell this kind of wire. So to get started, I would suggest that, or of course copper or brass. And like I mentioned, you can find the copper or brass in hardware stores. Good luck finding it. I find hardware stores completely overwhelming, but it is there. So on to rings specifically, and I am talking about rings specifically because in April we have an upcoming e-course and daily challenge called Rings Every Day. There will be a free version and an upgraded premium version that you would pay for. The difference is the free version is kind of like inspiration, and I might send you to my blog for free tutorials I have done, throughout the years on my blog. The premium or paid version, there will be an actual tutorial for you to learn from every single day. And if you think it sounds overwhelming to make a ring every single day, we did do earrings every day last September, and I had a lot of people do that. So rings, once you know how to make them, can be just as quick. There will be some more difficult rings that may take you a little more time, but there will also be quicker rings so that you can quickly make a ring. So that is why I am talking about wire and rings, just in case you want to start thinking about what kind of wire you're going to need for rings every day. So you see I have a whole collection of rings here. So to start off, I would say that the gauge you need is going to depend upon the ring you're making. So I'm going to give you a couple examples. I'm going to tell you what kind of gauge of wire. I would say that most of the time, if not all of the time, you are going to want round wire. And furthermore, that you'll probably want to use half hard wire because it's easier to work with. Some of you may prefer to even use dead soft wire. If you find it's challenging to work with wire, it's difficult for your hands to work with wire. So that is an overall suggestion, and I'm going to show you some examples and what gauges I would use for those rings. So just last week on ECT TV, we made these adorable adjustable heart rings. And the gauge we used for these was 18 gauge. And the reason why is because this ring the band is only one wire. So I wanted to use a little bit of a thicker gauge, so 18 gauge wire, so it would be a little more stable and secure once I was done. So for this particular ring, I used 18 gauge. 16 gauge maybe would be a little bit too thick, and 20 gauge would probably be okay as well. 22 and higher in number, or thinner in gauge, would be too thin for this. So let me just take a moment to explain that. The higher the number when you see a gauge of wire, so say 20 gauge and 24, so the higher the number, the thinner the wire. So a 24 gauge wire will be thinner than a 20 gauge wire. 18 gauge is thicker than 20 gauge. It's kind of backwards to what you would think. Okay, so here are a few more examples of rings I've made with 18 gauge wire. And again, it's because it's more of a single wire, and so I want to make sure it's nice and strong while I'm wearing it, and it stays together, holds its shape, and it stays in a round shape. I'll show you in a minute. I do use 20 gauge more often, but that's for a different type of ring. You also might want to use 18 gauge for a ring sort of that's more complicated like this, and then use like 22 or 24 gauge wire for all the intricate wrapping, for all the wrapping of the beads here. But you're kind of making a base, so you might want to use 18 gauge. I think on this ring I can tell it's 20 gauge, but it would be really good to use 18 gauge there too. So kind of any ring like this where it's got to hold its shape well without the benefit of having several wires together, you want to use maybe a thicker gauge wire, but 20 gauge would work fine too. So the gauge of wire I most commonly use when I'm making wire wrapped rings is actually 20 gauge wire. So 20 gauge half hard round wire. These are some examples of rings I've made of 20 gauge wire, and you'll see, I'll show you, these rings have 4 wires showing in the back. So they'll have multiple wires showing in the back, usually 4, sometimes maybe 3 or possibly 5. And so the 20 gauge wire works great because there's plenty of wires in the back to hold it all together. So that's why I mostly use 20 gauge. Also, 20 gauge is easy to work with, and so once you get working with it, and you get all the wires wrapped around, it's very sturdy. Alright, this is another example of a ring made with 20 gauge wire. Now, you'll see that there are some small beads going around a larger bead, and that's something you have to pay attention to when you're making rings, is will the wire fit through the bead. The thicker of wire you use, the harder it's going to be for the wire to go through, especially small beads that have a small borehole in them. So, that is something to just pay attention to. So this is the wire circle ring, and this is on one of my ECT TV episodes. I show you how to make this ring. And I just wanted to show you this because actually these 2 rings, which are the same ring, the same pattern, the same tutorial, I actually, when I made it in 2 different gauges. So this one's in 20 gauge and this one's in 22 gauge. The 20 gauge worked fine, and it's hard to even tell a difference, really. I know because I'm touching them and I'm looking at them very closely and I can tell. And this one's in 22 gauge. And I wanted to use a smaller gauge because of the look I was going for. So I was wrapping around many times. So that's why I was using a 24 gauge, or I'm sorry, 22 gauge wire here. And I'm pretty sure I just made a 20 gauge on this one because I was, you know, experimenting and trying. So either way, it worked out just fine. So sometimes you might just want to try something with whatever wire you have on hand and see how it works out, and then you can experiment from there. And that is why it's a good idea to use wire that's less expensive while you're just practicing. So that is an overview of wire and rings. I know that I didn't say, yes, definitely always use a certain gauge, but each project does call for a different type of gauge. And if you follow my tutorials, I will tell you exactly what I suggest. Sometimes you can experiment with what you have on hand. Sometimes you don't have exactly what the tutorial calls for. You can try it with a different gauge and see how it works out. And that's why it's great if you start out with less expensive wire to do your experimenting, and then maybe get more expensive wire to do your final ring with. You can find out what works, what doesn't work, and how it's going to work out. So I hope to see you for Rings Every Day month, which is April. So we'll start right on April 1st. I will place a link so you can go read more about it and sign up if you like. And I will talk to you soon.